7 months ago, when I was 38 years old, I sat in a funeral home choosing a coffin for my 6-month-old son, while my husband raised a glass of champagne on a luxury cruise through the Caribbean. The television in the arrangement room was playing quietly behind the funeral director. I would not have looked up if the host had not laughed and called a woman in a silver birthday sash toward the camera. That woman was my mother. My younger sister stood beside her in a white sundress. My husband stood on the other side, one hand around a champagne flute, smiling as if the worst thing that had happened to our family was already far behind him. My phone was still in my hand. I opened my credit card app and saw $12,480 in new charges. 3 last-minute cruise fares, 2 cabins, a beverage package, a shore excursion. Every dollar had been charged to the card I kept open for our son's medical bills. I called my husband and asked, "Where are you?" His voice dropped into the careful tone he used when he wanted me to believe he was standing in his warehouse office. "At work," he said. "I'm handling something. I'll call you later." On the television, a cruise employee handed him another glass of champagne. I closed my eyes and said, "Enjoy your vacation." Then I ended the call. Before I tell you what happened after that, I hope you are doing well today. Stay with me, because what I discovered about my husband, my mother, and my sister was worse than the cruise, and please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story. The funeral director's name was Mara Chen. She sat across from me with both hands resting on a catalog neither of us wanted to open. On the page between us was a photograph of a small white coffin lined with pale blue fabric. Under the photograph was the word infant, printed in the same clean font used for prices and product numbers. My son's name was Eli. He had been born in October with a complex heart condition. By April, our house had become a place of medicine schedules, oxygen readings, feeding charts, and whispered conversations after midnight. I had learned to measure time in ounces of milk and changes in the color around his lips. Now I was being asked whether I preferred satin or cotton around his body. Mara glanced at the television, then back at me. "Is that your family?" I nodded once. She reached for the remote, but I stopped her. "Please leave it on." I needed to know I had really seen them. My mother, Diane, was laughing while the host admired her birthday sash. Lydia leaned into the camera and said they were celebrating a fresh start. Gavin smiled beside them, looking rested in a way I had not seen since before Eli was born. Mara took out her phone and recorded several seconds of the television screen. "You may want this later," she said quietly. That was the first useful kindness anyone gave me that week. I forwarded the clip to a private email account before I did anything else. Then I downloaded the credit card statement as a document. The charges had been made early the previous morning, less than 12 hours after Gavin and I signed the papers, allowing the funeral home to receive Eli. The cruise had not been booked months before. It had not been a non-refundable family vacation they were afraid to lose. Gavin bought it after our son died. My hands were cold, but they were steady. I locked the card. I removed Gavin as an authorized user. I saved screenshots showing the booking times and the names attached to each charge. I did not report the card stolen, because it had not been stolen. Gavin had been allowed to use it. He had simply believed that permission included spending our son's emergency money on champagne. My phone started ringing before I finished downloading the last statement. Gavin called first. I declined it. My mother called next, followed by Lydia, and then Gavin again. I turned the phone face down. Mara watched me without asking whether I was sure. I was grateful for that. People often mistake a calm woman for a confused one. They think silence means she has not decided yet. I had decided. "Can the service be held on Saturday?" I asked. Mara hesitated. "Your husband signed the authorization, but does he know the date?" "He knows we are arranging our son's funeral. If he wants to attend, he knows how to come home." The cruise had not sailed from some unreachable corner of the world. They had driven from Savannah to Port Canaveral and boarded it after Eli died. They could have stayed in Georgia. They could have helped me choose his clothes. They could have sat beside me while I signed forms no mother should ever see. They chose the ship. I chose not to wait for them. Mara moved the catalog aside and brought me a simpler folder. We selected Saturday morning. She explained that most of the paperwork had already been completed when the funeral home received Eli, so the remaining decisions could be made in time. I had to choose the coffin, the flowers, the music, and the clothes my baby would wear. Each decision felt obscene in its normality. When Mara asked what Eli should wear, I pictured the tiny gray outfit folded in his dresser. One of the socks had a loose heel because he always kicked it off. No matter how carefully I pulled it back on, I would find his bare foot resting against the blanket a few minutes later. "I'll bring his clothes tomorrow," I said. My voice broke for the first time. Mara closed the folder. "You do not have to finish everything right now." "Yes, I do," I answered. Not because I was stronger than anyone else. I had spent most of my life being told I was the strong one, usually right before someone handed me a burden they did not want. I finished because Eli deserved one person who would not leave him waiting. I called my best friend Renee from the parking lot. I did not tell her I was fine. I told her I needed someone in my house before I got there. "I'm on my way," she said. She did not ask questions, give me a speech about forgiveness, or request that I consider what grief might have done to Gavin. As I sat in my car, rain tapped softly against the windshield. My credit card app refreshed. The cruise line had attempted another charge for onboard expenses, but the card was locked. For the first time that day, I felt something that was not grief. It was not satisfaction. It was clarity. Gavin had expected me to clean up the consequences, as I always had. He expected me to pay the bill, delay the funeral, soothe my mother, protect Lydia, and accept whatever explanation he prepared before returning home. He had made one mistake. He thought losing Eli had made me too broken to notice what people were doing around me. The truth was that grief had stripped away everything except what mattered. Opened the message thread with Gavin and searched for the word monitor. 3 weeks earlier, I had asked him why Eli's pulse oximeter sounded quieter than usual. Gavin had been standing beside the crib, pressing buttons, while Eli slept beneath the slow turn of the ceiling fan. "I fixed it," he had said. "It won't scream over a loose sensor anymore." At the time, I thought he meant he had secured the probe or adjusted something harmless. Sitting in the funeral home parking lot, I read the message beneath that memory again. He had said he fixed it. He had not said the machine changed on its own. He had said he changed it. 7 months later, I can still remember the exact moment my grief made room for the first terrible question. What else had my husband fixed before our son died? To understand why Gavin's words frightened me, you need to understand what our house had become during the last months of Eli's life. It was not always a place of fear. Some of my clearest memories are quiet ones. Eli lying beneath the ceiling fan in our living room, watching the wooden blades turn as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. Gavin would hold him against his chest and walk in slow circles whenever he became restless. Eli had a habit of kicking off his left sock. I could pull it back on 5 times, and 5 minutes later his bare foot would be resting against Gavin's arm. "Your son has declared war on socks," Gavin once said. "Our son," I corrected him. Gavin smiled and kissed the top of Eli's head. "Our stubborn little boy." That memory matters because Gavin did love our son. I have never needed to lie about that in order to tell the truth about what he did later. Love did not make him patient. It did not make him humble. It did not stop him from believing his judgment mattered more than every instruction we had been given. Eli was part of a home monitoring program for infants with complex heart conditions. We checked his oxygen level, feeding amount, weight, and behavior every day. We had a thick binder from the hospital with instructions organized by color. Green meant, continue watching. Yellow meant call the cardiology team. Red meant, do not wait. The nurse coordinator who trained us was named Paula Grant. She had a calm voice, and the kind of direct manner that made panic feel unnecessary, but action feel urgent. During our final training session, Paula sat with Gavin, Lydia, and me around a small table at the hospital. The pulse oximeter rested between us. She showed us how to place the sensor, how to warm Eli's foot if his skin was cold, and how to repeat a reading if movement caused an unusual number. Then she closed the equipment guide, and looked at each of us. If he has one low reading but looks comfortable, reposition the sensor and check again, she said. If the reading stays low, or if he is difficult to wake, refuses to feed, has gray coloring around his mouth, or struggles to breathe, you call us. She tapped the red section of the binder. If several of those things happen together, you do not call a relative and ask whether you should seek help. You call emergency services. Lydia nodded quickly. Even if the machine has been wrong before? The machine is one piece of information, Paula said. The baby is another. You do not ignore what you can see because you hope the number is wrong. Gavin leaned back in his chair. These things throw false alarms all the time though, right? They can give poor readings if the sensor is loose or the baby is moving, Paula answered. That is why you check again. It is not a reason to dismiss repeated readings with visible symptoms. Paula made all three of us demonstrate the procedure. Lydia performed it correctly. She repeated the red flags without looking at the binder and signed the caregiver acknowledgement beneath Gavin's and mine. I took a photograph of the machine's settings and placed a printed copy in the front pocket of the binder. Gavin teased me for it on the drive home. You know the hospital already has records, he said. I know. This is for us. You document everything. That is why nobody has to guess. He gave me a tired smile. Sometimes people are allowed to live without building a case file. I should admit that Gavin was not entirely wrong about me. When I became afraid, I became organized. I made lists because lists had edges. Illness did not. I labeled medication syringes. I wrote feeding totals in 2 places. I kept receipts that insurance companies had not asked for. I checked doors twice and alarms 3 times. That made me useful, but not always easy to live with. There were nights when Gavin wanted to hold Eli without me asking when he had last eaten. Lydia sometimes stopped telling me small mistakes because she expected a lecture instead of a conversation. I can see that now. What I will not do is pretend my personality caused them to ignore an emergency plan. My flaws explain some of the tension in our family. They do not excuse what happened. The first false alarms were real. One night, about 6 weeks before Eli died, the pulse oximeter sounded after midnight. Gavin and I ran into the nursery. The number on the screen was low, but Eli was awake and angry, kicking both legs. The sensor had loosened beneath his pajama cuff. I repositioned it, warmed his foot, and waited. The reading returned to his usual range. Gavin stood beside the crib, with both hands pressed against his face. That sound is going to stop my heart before his, he said. I was too tired to answer. It happened again several nights later, then twice during one long afternoon when Eli would not keep his foot still. Each time the number improved after we adjusted the sensor. Each time Gavin became more certain that the machine was the problem. The thing panics more than you do, he told me once. That is not a competition. It screams over everything. It is supposed to get our attention. We are already watching him every second. He was not wrong that we were exhausted. We slept in pieces. We spoke to each other through medication schedules and appointment reminders. Some days Gavin worked from the dining table, while warehouse employees called about delayed trucks and missing inventory. Other days he drove to the office before sunrise and returned after Eli was asleep. Still, exhaustion was not the only thing changing him. Gavin hated being corrected by a machine. He hated that a number could interrupt dinner, sleep, work, or an argument. Every alert reminded him there was something in his own house he could not control. At the time, I described his behavior as frustration. 7 months later, I would call it something more dangerous. He began treating the alarm as an opponent. One evening, he stood beside the monitor and said he was going to find a way to make it less insane. I assumed he meant he would call the hospital. What I did not know then was that he used his personal email to contact the manufacturer. He asked how to reduce the alarm volume without changing the oxygen threshold. The message was not written like a confession. Gavin did not believe he was doing anything criminal. He described himself as a sleep-deprived father, dealing with frequent false alarms, and asked for instructions that were available in the equipment guide. I would not learn about that email until months later. At the time, all I saw was a husband losing patience and a baby who still smiled when that husband lifted him beneath the ceiling fan. The week before Eli died, I had a postpartum appointment I had already postponed twice. I had not recovered as well as I pretended. I was tired, losing weight, and having headaches that I blamed on broken sleep. Renee had been telling me for weeks that I needed to see my own doctor. "You cannot keep acting like your body stopped existing when Eli was born," she said. "I have more important appointments. You are one of his caregivers. Your health is one of his needs." My doctor's office called and told me that if I canceled again, the next available appointment might be weeks away. I considered canceling anyway. Lydia offered to stay with Eli. She had completed the hospital training. She had cared for him before while I worked in the next room or picked up prescriptions. She knew where the binder was, knew the numbers to call, and could perform a pulse ox check correctly. I did not abandon my sick child with an untrained person. I made a reasonable decision based on what I knew. That distinction took me months to accept. The afternoon before my appointment, Lydia came over carrying an old silver MacBook covered with faded stickers. She said she had saved videos of ceiling fans because Eli always became quiet when he watched them. Gavin laughed at her until she opened one, and Eli immediately stopped fussing. "See?" Lydia said. "I understand my nephew. You found his favorite form of entertainment," I told her. "That does not make you a cardiologist." She rolled her eyes, but she smiled. The MacBook ended up on our kitchen counter. Nobody understood then that it would eventually preserve the messages Lydia believed she had deleted. 19 days before Eli died, I heard the monitor alarm while I was washing bottles. The sound was quieter than I remembered. Not silent, but muffled enough that running water nearly covered it. I dried my hands and went to the living room. Gavin was crouched beside the machine. Eli lay beneath the fan, kicking his bare left foot. "What happened to the volume?" I asked. "I fixed it." "What does that mean?" "It will still alert us. It just will not scream every time the sensor slips." "You changed the setting?" "I adjusted the sound. I did not change the numbers." Before I could ask anything else, my phone rang. It was the cardiology clinic confirming an appointment. I checked Eli's color, repositioned the sensor, and watched the reading settle into his normal range. Then I let the conversation move on. That was one of the failures I punished myself for later. I had heard the difference. I had asked the question. Then a normal reading allowed me to believe the danger had passed. After I saw Gavin on the cruise, I called Paula from the funeral home parking lot. I did not accuse him of harming Eli. I told her only what I remembered. "The alarm sounded quieter several weeks ago," I said. "Gavin told me he had fixed it. Could a software update have changed the volume?" Paula was silent long enough that I could hear her keyboard. "There was no firmware update issued through our program," she said. "Could the hospital have changed it remotely?" "No, we cannot control that machine from here." I gripped the steering wheel. "Then how would the volume become lower?" Paula's answer was calm, but nothing in my life felt calm after I heard it. "If it was lower, Sloan, someone had to stand in front of the machine and change it." Paula's words stayed with me as I drove home from the funeral home. Someone had stood in front of Eli's monitor and lowered the alarm volume. Gavin had already admitted that much when he told me he had fixed it. What I did not know was whether that decision had anything to do with the morning Eli died. I refused to turn suspicion into certainty before I had evidence. That was one of the hardest things I did during those first days. Anger wanted an immediate answer. Grief wanted a person to blame. I had to live between them and admit that I did not yet know enough. Renee was waiting in my driveway when I arrived. She opened my car door, took my bag, and led me inside without touching the boxes of medical supplies stacked near the kitchen. The ceiling fan was still turning in the living room. I switched it off. My phone began ringing again before I had removed my coat. Gavin's name filled the screen. This time I answered, and put him on speaker so Renee could hear. "What did you do to the card?" he demanded. "I removed your access. You stranded us without warning. You are on a cruise ship. You are not stranded. My card is being declined. The ship needs another payment method for onboard expenses. Then use your own money." There was a pause. Behind him, I heard music and the distant sound of people talking. Gavin lowered his voice. "Sloan, I know how this looks. I watched you drink champagne on television while I chose our son's coffin. I know exactly how it looks. He said the cruise had been Diane's dream for years. She had talked about taking one for her 65th birthday, although her birthday was still months away. They had never booked it because Eli's treatment schedule made planning impossible. After Eli died, Gavin said, everything in the house had become unbearable. We needed somewhere to breathe, he told me. Your mother was falling apart. Lydia was worse. I was trying to keep everyone from collapsing. You bought the trip after Eli died. It was a last-minute decision. You used the card I kept for his medical bills. We are married. I am an authorized user. That authorization ended today. His breathing changed. He was not crying. He was trying to control his temper. You are punishing my mother and your sister because you are angry with me. I am refusing to finance your vacation. It is not a vacation. I looked at the recording Mara had sent me. Gavin was smiling with a champagne glass in his hand. Lydia wore sunglasses on top of her head. My mother's silver sash said birthday queen. What would you call it? I asked. He did not answer. Instead, he told me the booking could not be refunded. That lie was almost careless. The charge timestamps showed that he had purchased the trip early on Tuesday morning, hours after Eli died. Even if the fares were non-refundable by Thursday, Gavin had been the person who created that problem. He spoke as if a policy had forced him onto the ship. The truth was simpler. He had chosen to buy the tickets. I need you to postpone the service, he said. We will be back Monday. The funeral is Saturday morning. You cannot bury our son without me. I am not preventing you from attending. We are already at sea. You knew I was arranging the funeral before you boarded. His voice sharpened. You never gave me a final date. I sent you the proposed date yesterday morning. He said nothing. I opened the message thread while we were still on the call. My text had been delivered at 7:43 on Wednesday morning. Mara has availability Saturday, April 18th, at 10. I am confirming unless you object before noon. Gavin had replied at 8:17. Do what you think is best. I cannot deal with details right now. Port Canaveral was almost 5 hours from our home outside Savannah. Cruise records later confirmed that they boarded shortly after 3 that afternoon. They had not been trapped by a ship when they learned the funeral date. They had known the date before they finished driving through Georgia. You told me to handle it, I said. I thought you understood that we needed to be there. I understood that you did not want to deal with the details. That is not what I meant. It is what you wrote. He accused me of twisting his words, then said he would call after I had calmed down. I ended the call first. A minute later, my mother called. Diane did not begin with an apology. She began by asking whether I understood how frightened Lydia was. Your sister has barely slept, she said. She keeps replaying that day. So do I. You process things differently. What does that mean? You are practical. You have always been able to function in a crisis. I looked at Renee. Her mouth tightened, but she remained silent. My mother continued. You know how to deal with paperwork. You know how to speak to doctors and funeral directors. Eli's service will be beautiful because you are taking care of it. Why are you not here taking care of me? The question stopped her for several seconds. When she answered, her voice became soft in the way it always did when she wanted cruelty to sound like affection. Because you are the strongest person in this family. I had heard versions of that sentence since childhood. When Lydia failed a class, I helped her study. When my parents argued, I took her into my room. When Diane needed someone to handle insurance forms, repair appointments, or a difficult phone call, she called me. My strength had never earned protection. It had become the reason everyone believed I needed less of it. I do not want to be the strongest person in the family today, I said. Oh honey, none of us gets to choose what we are capable of. You chose to get on the ship, Diane exhaled sharply. Sitting at home would not bring Eli back. No, but it would have meant I did not choose his coffin alone. She told me Lydia could not face me yet. She said my sister needed to remain close to her and Gavin because she was emotionally unstable. At the time, I thought Diane was only protecting the child she had always considered fragile. Months later, I learned she had another reason for keeping Lydia in the cabin beside hers. My mother did not want Lydia to speak to me alone before the three of them agreed on what had happened that morning. "I need to go," Diane said. "Please do not make permanent decisions while you are in shock. You made a permanent decision when you boarded." I ended the call. That afternoon, Mara emailed copies of the funeral documents. Gavin and I had both signed the authorization allowing the funeral home to receive Eli. A separate section named me as the person responsible for completing the arrangements. There was no condition requiring me to wait for Gavin. I sent him one final message with the date, time, address, and Mara's phone number. "Eli's funeral will be held Saturday at 10. You are welcome to attend. I will not delay it for the cruise." I saved the message and his red receipt. Then I opened the folder Mara had created for the travel footage. She had recorded the television with her phone, but I wanted the original broadcast preserved before it disappeared. I emailed the station's viewer desk and asked where archived segments could be requested. Later that afternoon, Mara confirmed that the funeral home's attorney had sent a formal request to preserve the clip. I was learning that evidence did not preserve itself simply because something unfair had happened. Renee made soup while I checked the home camera account. We had cameras in the living room and hallway, but never inside Eli's nursery. They were meant for security, not surveillance. The service retained footage for 30 days. I downloaded everything from the day Eli died. The files showed Lydia moving between the nursery hallway and the living room. They showed the time she picked up her phone and the time emergency responders entered the house. They did not show Eli or tell me what she saw. I copied the footage to an external drive and gave it to Renee. "Keep this somewhere Gavin cannot reach," I said. She took the drive without asking whether I was overreacting. My phone vibrated on the table. A message notification from Lydia appeared on the locked screen. I opened it immediately, but the message had already been deleted. The conversation showed only a blank space where her words had been. The preview remained in my memory. I didn't mean to wait that long. The deleted message remained on my screen for less than a second, but I wrote down the words before grief could blur them. I didn't mean to wait that long. Renee read the sentence over my shoulder. "Wait how long? I don't know." The home camera footage gave me the beginning of an answer. Our cameras did not record Eli's nursery, but the hallway camera showed Lydia moving between the nursery door and the living room on the morning he died. At 10:07, she came out carrying the pulse oximeter and placed it on the coffee table. She looked toward the nursery, then picked up her phone. At 10:12, she made a call. At 10:16, she returned to the nursery. 8 minutes later, she came out again, moving faster. She made another call and paced beside the couch with one hand pressed against her mouth. At 10:34, she finally opened the front door for emergency responders. The footage had no sound. It did not show Eli's face or the number on the machine. It could not tell me whether Lydia had spent those minutes checking his sensor, following instructions, or simply hoping the problem would disappear. It proved only that 27 minutes passed between the first visible sign of concern and the arrival of help. I watched the sequence 3 times. On the 4th viewing, I stopped looking at Lydia and focused on her phone. Both calls before emergency services had been long enough for a conversation. I called her. The ship was still somewhere in the Caribbean. Lydia answered after several rings, and music thudded faintly behind her voice. "What did you mean?" I asked. She did not pretend she had forgotten the message. I was upset. "You wrote that you didn't mean to wait that long. I shouldn't have sent it." "How long did you wait?" She inhaled sharply. "I can't do this right now." "Did you call Gavin before you called for help?" The music disappeared. I heard a door close, then the softer sound of an enclosed cabin. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because the cameras show 2 calls. You were watching me?" "I checked the security footage from the day my son died. I told you what happened. You told me Eli was sleeping, then suddenly stopped breathing. That is not what the footage shows. You cannot see anything from that camera. I can see you made 2 calls." She was silent. "Were they to Gavin?" "I called his father because I was scared." "Why didn't you call the cardiology team?" "You are doing exactly what Mom said you would do." "What did Mom say?" "That you would turn this into an investigation because you need someone to blame." I looked at Renee. She shook her head, warning me to slow down. I did not. Did you hear the alarm, Lydia? I have to go. Did you hear it? She ended the call. Within 20 minutes, my mother sent a message to the family group. We need to stop interrogating people who are grieving. Lydia followed the information she had. Gavin has lost his son too. Accusations will not bring Eli back. I had not accused Gavin of anything. I had only asked Lydia whom she called. Diane's message told me Lydia had immediately gone to her. Another message appeared from Gavin. Do not contact Lydia again until you can speak calmly. I saved both messages and opened my conversation with Lydia. Several older messages were missing, including one she had sent the day Eli died, saying she was having trouble keeping the sensor in place. Gavin's thread had changed too. A message in which he complained that the alarm was making everyone insane was gone. I had copies of some messages and screenshots and email notifications, but not all of them. That was when I realized I had made a mistake. I had called Lydia because I wanted an answer before she could prepare one. Instead, I warned all three of them that I was looking at the timeline. Renee helped me find an attorney that afternoon. Claire Donovan handled divorce and civil cases involving concealed marital finances. She agreed to speak with me after Renee explained that funeral arrangements and medical equipment were involved. I showed Claire the credit card records, the funeral authorization, the camera footage, and the messages I had saved. She did not tell me Gavin had committed a crime. She did not promise that anyone would be arrested. She asked careful questions and separated what I knew from what I assumed. Do you have proof those calls were to your husband? She asked. Not yet. Do you have proof he told her to delay? No. Do you know who lowered the alarm? He admitted changing it, but I do not know whether I can prove when. Claire nodded. Then those are the gaps. We preserve what still exists before asking more questions. She prepared letters instructing Gavin, Diane, and Lydia to retain messages, call records, emails, photographs, cloud backups, and devices related to Eli's care and the morning he died. I asked whether the letters would stop them from deleting anything. No letter can control what a frightened person does, she said. It establishes that they were told not to destroy material that may become evidence. I admitted that I had already confronted Lydia. Claire looked at the notification preview I had written down. You may have caused them to start cleaning their phones. I know. Do not make the same mistake twice. She did not soften the warning, and I respected her for it. Before the preservation letters were delivered, Lydia called me again. Her voice sounded different. The defensiveness was still there, but beneath it was exhaustion. I heard the monitor, she said. I closed the door to Eli's room and sat on the hallway floor. Tell me exactly what happened. He wouldn't finish his bottle. I thought he was tired, but when I picked him up, he felt loose. Not asleep, just heavy. Did you check his color? His mouth looked a little gray. I put the sensor on his foot, but the number was low. What number? I don't remember. That answer was too quick. Did you take a picture? No. I wrote the denial in my notebook. What did you do next? I moved the sensor. The alarm was barely making any noise, so I thought it wasn't a real emergency. You had completed the training. Paula told you the sound did not decide whether the reading mattered. I know that now. You knew it then. She began crying. I called Gavin because he was Eli's father. I thought he would know if this happened all the time. What did he say? He said the sensor slipped a lot. He told me to warm Eli's foot, put it back on, and wait for a stable reading. How long did he tell you to wait? 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes? She hesitated. It was still low. Then why didn't you call emergency services? I called Gavin again. The second call on the camera footage. What did he say? He said to give Eli a little longer. Why? He said you would panic if I called you before we knew it was real. My hand tightened around the pen. Did he say anything about the alarm volume? Lydia's crying stopped. He said the sound had been lowered because it kept going off over nothing. Who did he say lowered it? He did. Did he tell you I knew? The silence answered before she did. Yes. What exactly did he say? He said you both agreed the machine was disrupting Eli's sleep. He said the volume was still high enough to hear if something serious happened. I never agreed to that. I believed him. You believed him, because believing him allowed you to wait. That isn't fair. Neither was using my name to ignore the plan I left for you. She hung up again. I wrote down every sentence I could remember, including the questions I had asked and the places where Lydia hesitated. I did not secretly record her. I created a contemporaneous record and emailed it to Claire before my memory could change it. Claire called after reading my notes. Lydia has now admitted the alarm sounded. The reading remained low, and Gavin directed her to wait, she said. But she is still withholding something. I think she photographed the screen. What makes you think that? She answered too quickly. That is an impression, not evidence. I know. Claire paused. There is another problem. If Gavin told Lydia that you approved the lower volume, we need to understand why. He wanted her to obey him. Maybe. But if he had already attached your name to the decision, was he preparing to blame you later, or did he simply need Lydia to stop questioning him? I stared through the open door at Eli's empty crib. At that point, I could not answer Claire's question. I only knew that before my son died, my husband had used my name to make a dangerous decision sound safe. On Saturday morning, 5 days after Eli died, I dressed my son for the last time. I had chosen a soft gray outfit with tiny white buttons. It was the same one Gavin once said made Eli look like a serious little businessman. I laid it beside the open box Mara had prepared for me, along with the blanket Eli used during his hospital visits. Then I picked up his socks. I placed both of them beside the outfit and stared until my vision blurred. Eli had never kept both socks on. His left foot always escaped, no matter how carefully I dressed him. I removed one sock and put it back in my purse. Mara saw me do it but did not ask why. She did not tell me it was beautiful or symbolic. She simply folded the remaining sock into the outfit and continued helping me. That quiet understanding was more comforting than anything my family had said. Gavin called while I was still at the funeral home. I need the live stream link, he said. There will not be a live stream. His voice tightened. I am his father. You have the time and address. I cannot get there before the service. You chose to board after I sent you the date. I thought you would wait. You thought I would handle everything and then rearrange it around your vacation. It is not a vacation, he snapped. I deserved to see my son's funeral. You deserved the chance to attend. You gave it away. He said I was using Eli to punish him. That accusation might have broken me a few days earlier. By then, I understood that Gavin treated every consequence as an attack, if he had not chosen it himself. I will not put my son's funeral on a screen beside a swimming pool, I said. If you wanted to be here, you should have stayed. I ended the call before he could answer. The chapel was small. Renee sat in the front row beside me. Mara stood near the door, watching for anything I needed without hovering. My Aunt Margaret arrived early and hugged me so tightly that I nearly lost my breath. Other relatives came quietly, carrying flowers and casseroles, speaking in lowered voices, as if loud sounds could cause another tragedy. Several people looked toward the empty seats beside me. Margaret finally asked, "Where are Diane and Lydia?" I could have shown her the television clip. I could have told everyone about the champagne, the birthday sash, and the $12,000 charge. I did not. They chose to board, I said. Margaret understood enough not to ask again. Gavin's parents attended. His father sat rigidly through the entire service. His mother cried when she saw the coffin and whispered that she had begged Gavin to come home. I did not comfort her. I did not blame her either. That morning belonged to Eli. When it was time for me to speak, I stood beside the coffin and looked at the faces gathered in the chapel. For several seconds, I could not find my voice. Then I remembered the ceiling fan. Eli loved things that moved slowly, I said. The ceiling fan in our living room could calm him when nothing else could. He would stare at it as if it knew a secret the rest of us had missed. A few people smiled through their tears. He hated wearing socks. I spent more time searching for one tiny sock than I ever thought possible. And whenever the nurses drew blood, he held my little finger so tightly that I could feel his heartbeat through his hand. I rested my fingers on the edge of the coffin. He was here for 6 months. That was not long enough for me, but it was long enough for him to become the center of every room he entered. I did not mention the monitor. I did not mention who had waited or who had lied. I spoke about the weight of Eli's body against my chest, the sound he made before he cried, and the way his eyes followed Gavin beneath the fan. I refused to let the worst decisions of his final morning become the whole story of his life. After the service, I stayed until everyone had left. Renee drove me home because I could not remember where I had parked. 3 voicemails were waiting on my phone. Lydia's message lasted 11 seconds. She cried, said she was sorry, and ended the call without explaining what the apology meant. Gavin's was longer. He said I had robbed him of the chance to say goodbye. He never mentioned the fact that he had been given the date before boarding. My mother's message was the longest. "You did not have to make it this way," Diane said. "We could have said goodbye together when we came home. Grief is making you cruel, Sloane. One day you will regret punishing everyone who loved him." I saved all 3 messages and forwarded copies to Claire. Then I went into the living room. The medical supplies were still where we had left them. Feeding syringes filled one basket. Sensor wraps and unopened gauze filled another. The binder sat beneath the pulse oximeter. I began putting everything into boxes because I could not bear to see a room arranged around a child who would never return to it. When I reached for the monitor, I remembered a message Diane had sent from the ship. "Donate all that equipment. Keeping it around will only make you sick." For most of my life, I had obeyed my mother when she told me what was healthiest for everyone. That afternoon, I stopped. I placed the monitor in a padded bag, sealed it, and wrote the date and time across the closure. Then I called Paula. She told me not to press any buttons or remove the memory module. The hospital had already opened a mortality review, and she could receive the equipment the next morning. On Sunday, Renee drove me to the hospital. Paula met us at the cardiology entrance with a biomedical technician. They photographed the machine, recorded its serial number, and gave me a signed receipt before opening the bag. The technician displayed the recent alarm history, without changing the stored data. He explained that the complete export would take longer and would be preserved through the hospital's review process. The screen showed repeated low readings beginning at 10:09 on the morning Eli died. Lydia's first written account said she noticed a problem shortly before 10:24. I stared at the 15-minute gap. Paula did not tell me what it meant. She knew better than to turn data into a conclusion it could not support. "The machine cannot tell us who changed the volume," she said. "It cannot tell us what Lydia saw in the nursery." She pointed to the sequence of readings. "But it can tell us this. Eli gave them more than one warning." Gavin came home 3 days after Eli's funeral, carrying a paper shopping bag from the cruise ship. I watched him set it on the kitchen counter, as if he had returned from an ordinary business trip. He looked thinner than he had on television, but not broken. His face was carefully unshaven, and the dark circles beneath his eyes seemed almost arranged to prove he had suffered too. "I brought you something," he said. Inside the bag was a small glass lighthouse painted blue and white. For several seconds, I could not understand why the sight of it made me feel sick. Then I saw the folded receipt beneath the tissue paper. The lighthouse had been charged to our cabin account before I locked the card. I had paid for my own grief souvenir. "I thought you might like it," Gavin said. I left it on the counter. He looked toward the living room, where the ceiling fan was no longer turning. The medical supplies had been boxed, and the space beside Eli's crib monitor was empty. "Where is the equipment?" "The hospital has the pulse oximeter." His eyes moved back to me. "Why?" "They opened a mortality review." His expression changed for only a moment, but I saw it. Fear came first. Then calculation covered it. "That is standard," he said. "I know." He waited for me to explain what the hospital had found. I did not. Renee was in the guest room with the door open. Gavin knew she was there. I had asked her to stay because I did not want my first conversation with him to happen without another person in the house. He noticed the suitcase beside the stairs. "You are making this look worse than it is. You went on a cruise after our son died. My being there would not have changed what happened. It would have changed who had to choose his coffin alone." His jaw tightened. I was trying to keep Lydia from falling apart. That became the first piece of his new version. Lydia was unstable. Diane was terrified for her. Gavin had gone because somebody needed to make sure neither woman did anything reckless. He described the ship as if it had been an emergency shelter instead of a vacation he purchased after Eli's death. You could have stayed in Savannah with Lydia, I said. She needed distance. From what? From the house. From the hospital. From you asking questions she could not answer. The words escaped before he could soften them. I studied his face. What questions did you expect me to ask? He looked away. Any mother would want to know why her child died. That was the pattern Gavin used throughout the conversation. Every sentence contained enough truth to survive its first hearing. The pulse oximeter had produced false readings before. True. Lydia had panicked. True. No doctor could promise Eli would have survived if help arrived earlier. True. I was better at paperwork and funeral arrangements than Gavin. Also true. He placed each fact in front of a different choice until the choices disappeared. 7 months later, I understood his strategy clearly. He did not need me to believe he was completely innocent. He needed me to believe the truth was too uncertain to pursue. I know you are angry, he said. But this cannot become your way of avoiding grief. You bought a cruise with the card we used for Eli's treatment. I will pay it back. With what money? My bonus. The same bonus account you told me was almost empty? He stared at me. At the time, I did not know he had been using that account to pay Diane's expenses and portions of Lydia's credit card debt. I only knew he had become vague whenever I asked about it. We can go through the finances later, he said. Right now, the hospital needs our statement. He opened his laptop and placed a document on the kitchen table. The title read, Parent Summary of Home Monitoring Event. Gavin had already filled in most of it. According to the draft, Eli had been sleeping normally before experiencing a sudden, unpredictable cardiac event. The pulse oximeter had malfunctioned, failed to provide a useful warning, and created confusion because of its history of unreliable readings. Lydia had acted as quickly as any reasonable caregiver could. The document never mentioned the 2 calls to Gavin. It never mentioned the lowered alarm volume. It never mentioned that Eli had refused his bottle, become difficult to wake, or developed gray coloring around his mouth. At the bottom were 2 signature lines. One for Gavin. One for me. I spoke to someone in the review office, he said. They said a joint statement would help close the loop. Who did you speak to? I don't remember her name. What data proves the machine malfunctioned? He rubbed both hands over his face. Sloan, this is what you do. You turn everything into an audit. You are asking me to sign a factual statement. I am asking you to stop treating our family like suspects. I asked what evidence supports one sentence. The machine had false alarms. That does not prove it failed that morning. His voice rose. Our son is dead. Do you think a spreadsheet is going to change that? No. Then what are you trying to accomplish? I looked at the signature line beneath my name. I am trying not to certify something I do not know is true. He pushed the laptop toward me. You heard the alarms yourself. You complained about them. I never said the machine malfunctioned. You knew it was unreliable. I knew a loose sensor could create a poor reading. That is why the instructions said to reposition it and check again. For the first time, Gavin stopped pretending he wanted to comfort me. If you refuse to sign, people will think you are accusing Lydia. Did Lydia write this? No. Did the hospital? No. Then you wrote a statement protecting Lydia and yourself, and you want my signature beneath it. I wrote what happened. You wrote what you need everyone to believe happened. He closed the laptop so hard the glass lighthouse trembled on the counter. Renee stepped into the hallway. Gavin looked at her, then lowered his voice. This is between my wife and me. Not while you are shouting in her house, Renee said. Our house. I had already discussed the property with Claire. Until a court ordered otherwise or we reached an agreement, Gavin still had rights connected to the home. I could not simply throw him onto the street because I hated what he had done. That did not mean I had to live alone with him. You can take the guest room tonight, I said. Tomorrow, communication about the divorce goes through counsel. He stared at me. What divorce? The one I am filing. His face went completely still. You cannot make that decision while you are in shock. I made it before you returned. Because I missed the funeral? Because you lied about where you were. Because you used my card. Because you are asking me to sign a false statement. The funeral showed me who you were. It did not create it. He said I was destroying what remained of our family. He said grief had made me vindictive. He said I would regret making permanent decisions before the hospital completed its review. I let him speak until he ran out of different ways to call my boundary an act of violence. The next morning, I met Claire Donovan at her office and formally retained her. The $8,000 payment came from the emergency fund Gavin had not been able to access. I hated using money I had saved for Eli, but Claire reminded me that protecting myself was now an emergency. We changed every password Gavin might know. She filed the divorce complaint and instructed me to keep all substantive communication in writing. Preservation letters had already gone to Gavin, Diane, and Lydia. Claire sent separate requests asking the bank, cruise line, funeral home, and broadcaster to retain their records. We are not alleging that he killed Eli, she told me. We are preserving evidence of what happened before and after the medical emergency. I understand. Do you? Her question was not cruel. I looked down at my notebook. I know the delay may not have changed the outcome. Then do not let anyone force you into claiming more than the evidence can support. Your credibility is one of the strongest things you have. That afternoon, Paula called with an update from the biomedical technician. The machine had preserved the readings and alarm history, but it had not recorded the identity of the person who changed the volume. I had expected that answer, yet disappointment still moved through me. So the machine cannot prove Gavin lowered it. No, Paula said. It can show that the volume differed from the discharge setting. It cannot show whose hand pressed the buttons. When I told Claire, she was quiet for a moment. Then we build a chain, she said. Opportunity, motive, communications, independent records, contradictory statements. No single piece needs to tell the whole story. I thought of the document Gavin wanted me to sign. He had tried to turn uncertainty into protection. Now uncertainty would have to be examined one piece at a time. Near the end of the day, Claire forwarded an email from an attorney representing Lydia. My sister wanted to cooperate, but only through counsel. She claimed she had found an old device containing messages that no longer appeared on her phone. At the bottom of the email was one sentence that changed the direction of the entire case. The device had never been connected to the internet after the preservation letter arrived. Lydia did not bring the old MacBook to my house. Her attorney delivered it directly to Claire Donovan's office in a padded case, along with a signed statement explaining where it had been stored. Lydia said she had used the laptop for messages until the battery began failing, then left it in a desk drawer. It had not connected to the internet since before Eli died. Claire hired a digital forensics examiner to copy the entire drive before anyone opened the messages application. He photographed the laptop, recorded its serial number, sealed the original after creating an exact forensic image, and worked only from the copy. I sat beside Claire while he explained the process in ordinary language. We are not searching the laptop like someone browsing old photographs, he said. We are preserving what was stored on it, including dates, delivery records, and deleted entries that may remain in the local database. I wanted him to skip the explanation and show me what Lydia had sent. Claire made me wait. If we use this later, she said, how it was preserved will matter as much as what it contains. The original message thread appeared on a monitor in Claire's conference room. At 10:12 on the morning Eli died, Lydia had sent Gavin a photograph of the pulse oximeter screen. The number was below the red threshold printed in our hospital binder. The message database showed the exact time the image left Lydia's account and the word delivered beneath it. The photograph alone could not prove Gavin had opened it, but the voice note he sent less than a minute later proved he had received the message. His voice filled the room. Move the sensor to the other foot, warm him up, and check again. Don't call Sloan yet. She'll panic before we know whether it's real. I gripped the edge of the table. The voice sounded completely normal. Gavin was not shouting. He did not sound intoxicated, confused, or frightened. He sounded mildly irritated, as if Lydia had interrupted him over a household inconvenience. 10 minutes later, Lydia sent another message. Still low. He won't take the bottle, and his mouth looks gray. Gavin answered with a second voice note. Give him a little longer. Hold him under the fan and see if he wakes up properly. These readings bounce all the time. There was no message telling her to call the cardiology team. No message telling her to follow the red emergency instructions. No message asking why Eli's mouth had turned gray. The examiner stopped the recording. Claire asked whether the files had been altered. Nothing in the local database indicates editing, he said. The timestamps are consistent with the device clock and the surrounding messages. I looked at the photograph again. For weeks, Gavin had described that morning as a sudden event he learned about after Lydia called for help. The thread showed that he had seen a red level reading 22 minutes before emergency responders arrived. He had not merely heard Lydia's confused version later. He had helped create the delay. The laptop was not the only thing Gavin's attorney had produced during the first exchange of documents in our divorce case. Claire had requested communications concerning the home monitoring equipment because Gavin wanted me to sign his statement blaming the machine. Buried in his email archive was a message to the manufacturer's support department, sent 20 days before Eli died. Gavin had written that repeated alarms were disturbing his child's sleep and exhausting the household. He asked for instructions to lower the sound without changing the oxygen limits. Support replied with the relevant page of the equipment guide and warned that caregivers remained responsible for ensuring alarms could be heard. Gavin thanked them. He had later told me he only fixed a loose sensor. The email proved that was another carefully selected half-truth. I called Paula after Claire sent the forensic report to the hospital review team. Paula listened without interrupting while I described the photograph and the voice notes. Does this prove he could have saved Eli? I asked. The question came out harsher than I intended. Paula answered carefully. It proves that the emergency plan was not followed. That is not what I asked. I know. If Lydia had called at 10:12 instead of waiting, would Eli still be alive? I cannot tell you that. You have the readings. We have readings, symptoms reported through messages, and the emergency timeline. We do not have a second version of that morning to compare with the one that happened. Her restraint felt unbearable. So he can say none of it mattered. He can say it. That does not make it medically true. But you cannot say the opposite. No. I ended the call before my anger turned cruel. Renee found me sitting on the floor beside Eli's crib that evening. I had printed the timeline and arranged the pages around me. You have been in here for 3 hours, she said. I am checking the sequence. You checked it yesterday. I may have missed something. She sat beside me without touching the papers. Are you looking for evidence? She asked. Or are you trying to find the one decision that would guarantee Eli lived? I hated the question because I knew the answer. If Paula would just tell me an earlier call would have saved him, then I would know. You already know they should have called. That is not the same. No, Renee said. It isn't, but no report can give you the life where they made the right choice. You are asking the evidence to answer grief. I gathered the pages into a stack. For weeks, I had believed that enough facts would eventually create certainty. Instead, each answer showed me the edge of what could never be known. Several days later, Gavin's financial disclosures gave Claire another part of the picture. His annual bonus account was not empty because of ordinary household expenses. Over the previous 2 years, he had transferred nearly $24,000 to Diane and Lydia. Some payments covered Lydia's credit card balances. Others paid my mother's property taxes, home repairs, and medical deductibles. The money had not come from our joint checking account, which was why I had not seen the transfers in our regular household statements. Gavin had treated his bonus as private money while using my salary and our shared account for most family expenses. I did not believe Diane and Lydia lied only because he gave them money. Their motives were more complicated than that. But the transfers explained the structure holding them together. Lydia depended on Gavin to rescue her from financial mistakes. Diane depended on him to maintain the life she could no longer afford alone. Gavin depended on both of them to repeat his version of Eli's final morning. Each person had something to lose if the others stopped cooperating. The forensic examiner found that cooperation in a second message thread stored on Lydia's laptop. It had been created while they were driving toward Port Canaveral, after they knew the funeral date but before they boarded the cruise. Diane had named the group Family Trip. The messages began with practical details about parking and cabin numbers. Then Lydia wrote. Sloane asked why I called Gavin first. Gavin replied. Do not answer while she's emotional. I'll explain the monitor. Diane wrote. The first call stays between us. There is no reason to make this worse. Lydia answered. But Sloane will ask why we waited. Several minutes passed before Diane responded. She will survive the answer. You won't. I read the sentence more than once. My mother had not been deceived after they returned from the cruise. She knew before she stepped onto the ship that Lydia had called Gavin before calling for help. She knew there had been a delay. She knew I would eventually ask about it. And she had already decided whose pain mattered more. For 38 years, Diane had called me strong whenever she needed me to carry something that belonged to someone else. That message showed me what the word had always meant in our family. Strong did not mean loved, trusted, or protected. It meant they believed I could survive being sacrificed. After I read Diane's message on Lydia's laptop, I asked my mother to meet me alone. She suggested my house first. I refused. I did not want her sitting beneath Eli's ceiling fan, telling me that sacrificing my pain had been an act of love. We met at her home on a humid afternoon in June. Renee drove me and waited outside. Claire knew where I was, but she had warned me not to treat the conversation like an interrogation. You are not collecting a confession, she said. You are giving her an opportunity to explain statements we already have. I carried printed copies of the group messages in a plain folder. I did not hide a recorder in my purse. Georgia allowed certain recordings, but I did not want the entire case depending on a conversation Diane could later claim had been manipulated or taken out of context. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She looked smaller than I remembered, but the house around her was unchanged. Family photographs covered the entryway. Lydia's college graduation stood beside my wedding portrait. A framed picture of Eli sat on the console table, surrounded by white flowers that had begun to brown at the edges. Diane followed my eyes. I talked to him every morning, she said. I did not ask what she told him. She led me to the dining room and poured coffee for both of us, without asking whether I wanted any. That was how my mother expressed control. She anticipated small needs so she could ignore larger ones. I placed the printed messages on the table. Her face changed when she saw them. Where did you get those? Lydia's old laptop. She had no right to give you private family conversations. They were conversations about my son. Diane sat down slowly. I knew Gavin had spoken to Lydia. I never denied that. You told me no one heard the alarm. That was what Lydia believed at first. The message says, the first call stays between us. Why? Because Lydia was hysterical. She was saying things she did not understand. She understood enough to ask why they had waited. My mother folded her hands around the untouched coffee cup. You have always been very good at taking words apart, she said. But you were not there that morning. Neither were you. No, but I saw Lydia afterward. She could barely breathe. She kept saying she had killed him. Did you tell her she had? Of course not. Did Gavin tell you he had lowered the alarm? Diane looked toward the window. That movement answered me before she spoke. He said the machine had been disturbing everyone for weeks, she said. He adjusted the sound. He did not turn it off. When did he tell you? At the hospital. Before Eli died? After the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. And he told you Lydia had called him before she called for help? My mother pressed her lips together. Yes. The word was quiet, but it changed the shape of everything. You knew before you left Savannah. I knew there had been a call. I did not know all the details. You knew enough to tell Lydia not to mention it. I told her not to let one terrified decision destroy the rest of her life. That was not your decision to make. Diane's eyes filled with tears. You think I did not lose anything? He was my grandson. Then why did you get on the ship? Because staying would not bring him back. It would have meant I did not bury him without my mother. You were not alone. I was without my family. We were grieving too. You were drinking champagne on television. Her face hardened. You keep returning to that image because it makes everything. We were not celebrating Eli's death. Lydia had not slept. Gavin could barely stand being in that house. I was trying to keep them from falling apart. And who was keeping me from falling apart? You do not fall apart. There it was. Not praise. Not faith. A sentence Diane had used to excuse leaving me unprotected since I was old enough to understand what protection meant. I buried my baby, I said. What did you think that was? She looked down at the table. You function. You make calls. You solve problems. Lydia does not have that kind of strength. So you decided she could survive the truth less easily than I could survive the lie. I decided one family had already lost a child. I was not going to let grief take 3 more people. 3? Lydia would have been destroyed. Gavin would have lost you. You would have lost your marriage. I counted the people she had named. Lydia, Gavin, me as Gavin's wife. Not me as her daughter. You were willing to let me live with a false story about my son because you thought keeping my marriage was more important than knowing what happened. I was trying to preserve what you had left. You were preserving your version of us. Diane stood and walked to the sideboard. Her shoulders shook, but I no longer assumed every tear meant remorse. You do not understand what it is like to be a mother, watching one daughter turn against another, she said. I understand what it is like to be a mother whose own mother chose the daughter who lied to her. That is cruel. It is accurate. She turned toward me. Lydia will not survive being treated like a criminal. I have never called her one. You hired lawyers. You took the monitor. You pulled old messages from a computer. I preserved what all of you tried to erase. Because you need someone to punish. No, I need the official story of Eli's last morning to be true. Diane reached for the papers and pushed them back toward me. Truth without mercy is just another kind of violence. Mercy without truth is permission. For once, she had no answer prepared. I left before the conversation became another loop in which my mother cried and expected me to comfort her for what she had done to me. Renee was waiting in the car with the engine running. I climbed into the passenger seat and wrote down everything I could remember before speaking. I noted Diane's exact words, the order of my questions, and the points she had admitted. Then I emailed the notes to Claire. The following morning, Claire sent Diane a formal letter summarizing the conversation. It did not accuse her of a crime. It asked her to confirm or deny several statements, including whether Gavin had told her about the lowered alarm and the first call before she left Savannah. Diane replied through her attorney. Most of her answer was careful. She denied organizing a cover-up and claimed she had only tried to prevent emotionally fragile people from making harmful statements during acute grief. One sentence was less careful. I did what was necessary to keep Lydia from being destroyed. Claire read it aloud in her office. She still thinks this helps her, I said. It explains her motive, Claire answered. That is not the same as helping her. 2 days later, Lydia's attorney forwarded a voicemail. Diane had called after receiving Claire's letter. Lydia did not answer, so my mother left a message nearly 2 minutes long. Her voice began softly. Lydia, I know Sloan and her lawyer are frightening you. You need to remember that Gavin was Eli's father, and you followed his instructions. Changing your story now will make you look dishonest. Then her tone shifted. If you sign anything blaming Gavin or me, do not come back here. I cannot have a daughter who destroys her own family to save herself. The preservation letter had already been delivered. The voicemail did not prove a criminal offense by itself. Claire made that clear. It did prove Diane was still trying to control Lydia's account after being told the communications might become evidence. My mother's love had always come with instructions. Now Lydia had finally received them in a form she could replay. The hospital completed its independent review near the end of June. Paula and the cardiologist met with me in a conference room. Gavin attended through his attorney by video. No one used the word murder. No one promised that a different decision would have saved Eli. The report stated that multiple red flags had been present: repeated low oxygen readings, poor feeding, reduced responsiveness, and gray coloring around the mouth. The emergency plan had not been followed. The alarm volume had been changed from the setting documented at discharge. The delay had eliminated an earlier opportunity for medical evaluation and intervention. The report could not determine whether the outcome would have been different. Gavin's attorney focused on that final sentence. I focused on the one before it. They had taken away Eli's chance to be evaluated sooner. Uncertainty about the result did not make that choice acceptable. Lydia asked to speak with me several days later through a joint call with our attorneys. She had agreed to sign an affidavit correcting her first account. She would admit she heard the alarm, saw the low reading, sent the photograph, called Gavin twice, and waited after Eli showed visible symptoms. Her voice shook when she asked, "If I do this, will you ever forgive me?" I could have offered hope to make cooperation easier. That would have been another family bargain, built on a promise no one could guarantee. "I will tell the truth that you cooperated," I said. "I will not promise a feeling I do not have." She cried quietly. Then she said, "That is more honest than Mom has ever been with me." In early July, Claire sent 3 separate demand letters. One went to Gavin. One went to Diane. One went to Lydia. Each letter described the evidence connected to that person and invited them to a private global settlement conference before we filed a civil complaint. For the first time, my family would not be allowed to answer as a single unit. They would enter the room separately represented, sit in front of separate evidence, and decide what they were willing to sacrifice now that I was no longer willing to sacrifice myself. The private settlement conference took place in a neutral mediator's office in Savannah 3 months after Eli died. It was not a family meeting, and it was not an ordinary divorce mediation. 4 disputes had become tangled together: the division of our marital finances, the cruise charges, Gavin's hidden transfers to Diane and Lydia, and the evidence connected to Eli's final mourning. Claire had warned each of them in writing that if no resolution was reached, we were prepared to file a civil complaint and begin formal discovery. Gavin came with his divorce attorney. Diane had hired her own lawyer. Lydia arrived with the attorney who had delivered her old MacBook. That mattered to me. For once, my mother could not answer for my sister. Gavin could not speak for everyone. Each person had someone whose only job was to protect that individual, not the family story. The mediator, Thomas Bell, was a retired judge with a quiet voice and no interest in dramatic speeches. He explained that the conference was confidential and voluntary. Nothing said during the negotiations could later be treated as courtroom testimony. I understood that the purpose of the day was not to collect another confession. It was to see whether they would accept responsibility when the evidence was placed directly in front of them. Gavin's first offer was generous enough to sound like surrender. He would credit the entire cruise expense against his share of the marital property. He would accept most of the remaining medical debt. He would not pursue part of the growth in my retirement account during the marriage. He would agree to list the house quickly and cooperate with the divorce. In return, I had to sign a statement saying there had been no intentional delay in seeking help for Eli, that the pulse oximeter had a history of unreliable readings, and that I would not pursue a civil claim against Gavin, Diane, or Lydia. Claire slid the draft toward me. The money was real. So was the relief it offered. Eli's care had left bills that arrived in white envelopes almost every week. Keeping more of my retirement account would protect years of work. A clean sale of the house would let me leave the rooms where I still expected to hear my son breathe. Gavin knew exactly what those things were worth to me. He also knew what the statement would cost. "This does not say the machine caused his death," his attorney said. "It simply acknowledges uncertainty. It says no one intentionally delayed," I replied. "There is no proof anyone intended harm." "Intent to harm and intent to wait are not the same thing." Gavin leaned forward. "I was trying to prevent panic. You were trying to prevent anyone from proving you were wrong." His lawyer touched his arm before he could answer. Claire opened the case beside her chair and placed 3 sealed envelopes on the table. They were not surprises. Every document inside had already been produced, preserved, or shared through counsel. The envelopes only separated the evidence by person. The first had Gavin's name. Inside were the message thread from Lydia's MacBook, his voice notes, the photograph of the low oxygen reading, his email asking the manufacturer how to lower the alarm volume, the statement he had tried to make me sign, the cruise folio, and records of the money he had transferred to Diane and Lydia. The second envelope belonged to Lydia. It contained her signed caregiver training acknowledgement, the 27-minute timeline, the camera records, the 2 calls to Gavin, her deleted message to me, and the corrected affidavit her attorney had drafted, but she had not yet signed. The third envelope carried Diane's name. Inside were the family trip messages, her written response admitting she had acted to protect Lydia, the voicemail threatening to cut Lydia off, and the timeline showing that she received the preservation letter before leaving that message. Thomas suggested that we break into separate rooms. Gavin refused. "We are already here," he said. "Let's stop pretending these are three different situations." That sentence revealed how he had survived for so long. As long as everything remained one family crisis, responsibility could be spread thin enough that no one had to carry a recognizable share. Claire looked at me. I nodded. The envelopes were opened. Gavin stared at the photograph Lydia had sent him. His face tightened before he turned toward her. "You told me he looked fine." Lydia went still. "I sent you that picture. You said the sensor was slipping." I said I moved it and the number was still low. "You told me his color improved." "No, I didn't. You did on the phone." Lydia's voice rose. "You told me not to call Sloane. I told you not to frighten her until you had a reliable reading. I sent you 2 readings." The room became silent. In his first written response, Gavin had claimed he did not see any photograph until after emergency responders arrived. He had just reacted to its contents, as if the argument had been waiting inside him for months. The admission could not be used as evidence outside the confidential conference. It did not need to be. Lydia had heard him deny what she knew he had seen. Whatever loyalty remained in her face disappeared. Diane reached across the table. "This is exactly why we should not discuss details while everyone is emotional." Lydia pulled her hand away. "You said Gavin would handle it. He was Eli's father. You said if I told Sloane about the first call, she would destroy me. I was trying to keep you from destroying yourself." Gavin gave a bitter laugh. "You were the one who insisted we leave Savannah." Diane turned toward him. "Because you told me Eli was already too sick for 20 minutes to matter. I said the doctors could not know whether it mattered. You said staying would only give Sloane someone to attack. I said she would blame Lydia." "You knew she would blame you," Lydia said. Gavin looked at her. "I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself through me." For the first time, no one asked me to settle their argument. Diane accused Gavin of using her loyalty. Gavin reminded her that he had been paying her property taxes. Diane said he had offered the money, so she would stop questioning his decisions. Lydia admitted she had accepted his help with her credit cards because it made it easier to believe he knew what he was doing. Their unity had never been built on trust. It had been built on debt, shame, fear, and the expectation that I would absorb whatever remained. Diane turned to me when she realized she could no longer control either of them. "Look what you're doing to this family." Her voice carried the same wounded authority she had used throughout my childhood. Normally, that sentence would have sent me searching for the fastest way to calm everyone. I looked at the 3 open envelopes. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm just not holding it together for you anymore." "Sloane, please," she whispered. "We have all suffered enough. There is no family version now. There is what Gavin did, what Lydia did, what you did, and what I will no longer do for any of you." Gavin pushed the settlement draft toward me. "You are walking away from financial security because you need revenge." "No, I am refusing to sell the truth for terms you should have offered without conditions." I closed the folder without signing. Then I stood. Claire gathered our documents and followed me toward the door. Behind us, Thomas began arranging separate meetings with each lawyer. Gavin called my name once. Diane called it twice. Lydia did not call after me. I left before I knew whether any of them would accept responsibility. That evening, Claire phoned me at Renee's house. Lydia had signed the corrected affidavit. She formally authorized the forensic copy of the MacBook to be used if litigation followed, and agreed not to challenge its authenticity. Gavin rejected the revised settlement. Diane refused to sign anything admitting she had coordinated their accounts. Claire waited a moment before speaking again. "Tomorrow we file." I looked at the single gray sock I had kept from Eli's funeral. Walking out of that room did not make me miss the collapse of my family. Walking out was what finally allowed it to begin. Claire filed the civil complaint the morning after the settlement conference. We did not accuse Gavin of murdering Eli. We alleged what the evidence could support: that he had altered the monitor's alarm volume, instructed Lydia to delay calling for help after receiving repeated red-level information, concealed those facts, and then tried to make me sign a false account of the event. The complaint also addressed the cruise charges and the money Gavin had secretly diverted from our marriage. Diane was named because of her role in coordinating the false account and pressuring Lydia after receiving the preservation letter. Lydia was not treated as innocent. Her corrected affidavit admitted that she ignored the emergency plan, called Gavin twice, waited after Eli showed visible symptoms, and lied to me afterward. Her cooperation changed how the case proceeded, but it did not erase what she had done. Once the lawsuit entered formal discovery, the three people who had once answered every question as a family had to provide documents and testimony separately. Gavin's deposition lasted nearly 7 hours. His attorney objected often, but objections could not repair the contradictions already preserved in his own words. At first, Gavin claimed he had lowered only the volume of a harmless sensor placement tone, not the medical alarm. The manufacturer's email showed that he had asked specifically how to reduce the alarm sound. He claimed Lydia had described Eli as sleepy but otherwise normal. The messages from her MacBook showed that she told him Eli would not eat, was difficult to wake, and had gray coloring around his mouth. He claimed he never saw the photograph until after emergency responders arrived. The voice note he sent less than a minute after the picture was delivered began with instructions to reposition the sensor. He claimed he never tried to conceal anything. Claire placed the unsigned parent statement in front of him and asked why he had written that the machine malfunctioned before the hospital completed its review. Gavin stared at the page for a long time. "I was trying to make sense of what happened," he finally said. "No," Claire replied. "You were trying to make your explanation arrive before the evidence." The transcript preserved that exchange. Diane performed no better under oath. She said she had not known about the first call before leaving Savannah. Claire showed her the family trip message written during the drive to Florida. She said she had never instructed Lydia to hide information. Claire read her own words back to her. "The first call stays between us." She said the voicemail, threatening to cut Lydia off, was the emotional reaction of a grieving mother. Claire asked whether grief had prevented her from understanding the preservation letter she had received the previous day. Diane admitted that she understood the letter. That answer mattered more than any dramatic accusation. My mother had spent her life surviving through carefully chosen language. Under oath, the careful language became a cage. Every attempt to soften her actions required her to admit another part of them. Lydia testified last. Her voice shook, but she did not change her account. She admitted that she knew the red emergency instructions. She admitted that she wanted Gavin to tell her she had not failed. She admitted that every minute she waited made calling for help feel more frightening because it would expose the minutes already lost. When Claire asked why she had lied to me, Lydia looked toward the floor. "Because the truth would have made me the person Sloane always feared I was." The answer hurt because it was honest. My sister had wanted to prove she was capable. When Eli needed her to act, she chose the reassurance that protected her self-image over the instructions that protected him. No judge ever ruled that an earlier call would certainly have saved Eli. The hospital's cardiologist repeated the same conclusion under oath. The outcome could not be known, but the delay had removed an earlier opportunity for evaluation and treatment. That uncertainty did not save Gavin. It only prevented the case from becoming something the evidence could not support. 6 months after the conference, Gavin agreed to settle. He credited the full cruise expense against his share of the marital estate. He accepted responsibility for the medical debt he had previously tried to use as leverage. The hidden transfers to Diane and Lydia were accounted for when we divided our property. He gave up his claim to part of my retirement growth in exchange for a faster resolution and no trial over the financial issues. The divorce was finalized after the required process, not in a single afternoon. By then, I had already moved out of the house and placed it on the market through our attorneys. Gavin also signed a factual acknowledgement. It did not say he caused Eli's death. It stated that he changed the alarm volume without informing me, received information showing repeated low readings and visible symptoms, advised Lydia to wait, and later omitted those facts from the statement he asked me to sign. That document became part of the settlement record. He could no longer tell people that the machine failed without anyone knowing. His employer eventually learned that he had used bereavement leave while boarding the cruise and had submitted conflicting explanations about where he had been. The company investigated him separately. He was dismissed months later for dishonesty connected to his leave and internal records, not because I demanded that anyone fire him. Diane settled after Gavin did. She refused to apologize, but she signed an acknowledgement that she knew about the first call before leaving Savannah and had encouraged Lydia not to disclose it. She agreed to stop contacting Lydia about her testimony and contributed toward the additional legal costs caused by the destroyed messages and delayed disclosures. My mother did not lose her house or go to prison. She lost the authority she valued more than either. Lydia moved out of Diane's home. Gavin stopped paying my mother's property taxes. Relatives who once called Diane whenever the family needed direction began asking questions she could not answer without contradicting sworn testimony. She continued telling people that I had destroyed the family because I could not forgive. For the first time, I did not correct her. Anyone who needed her version more than the record was not someone I needed to convince. Lydia received the least severe legal outcome because she cooperated early, preserved the MacBook, authenticated the messages, and corrected her statement before formal discovery began. She paid back her portion of the cruise and agreed to cover part of the forensic expense. She also enrolled voluntarily in a caregiver safety program recommended by her therapist, not because a court ordered it, but because she said she needed to understand why she had ignored training she could repeat from memory. I did not welcome her back into my life. About a year after Eli died, she mailed me a letter. There was no request for forgiveness inside. She wrote the timeline of that morning in her own handwriting, without excuses. At the end, she said she understood that telling the truth did not create a debt I had to repay with a relationship. I placed the letter in the case file. I did not answer it. The hospital changed what it could control. Caregivers received clearer written warnings that repeated low readings with visible symptoms required immediate action, regardless of previous false alarms. Backup caregivers were trained separately, instead of being allowed to rely on the parents' interpretations. The manufacturer began reviewing options for making alarm volume changes more visible. That process was still ongoing when the case ended. There was no perfect reform bearing Eli's name. No ribbon cutting, no foundation, no speech in front of cameras. That was what I wanted. My son had already been used as the center of too many false stories. 7 months after the funeral, I moved into a smaller house with high windows and a ceiling fan in the living room. For weeks, I kept the fan turned off. One evening, I opened the box containing Eli's things. I took out his hospital bracelet and the single gray sock I had carried away from the funeral home. My phone began ringing on the table. Diane's name appeared on the screen. There had been a time when seeing it would have filled me with responsibility. I would have wondered whether she was lonely, frightened, sick, or angry. I would have searched for the correct words to keep her from feeling the consequences of her own choices. That evening, I looked at her name until the call ended. I did not block her in anger. I did not answer from guilt. I placed the phone face down and turned on the ceiling fan. The blades began moving slowly above me, circling through the quiet. I held Eli's little sock in one hand and his bracelet in the other. For most of my life, my family had called me strong because they expected me to carry what they refused to face. They were right about one thing. I was strong, just not in the way they had planned. For the first time, I let the people who had broken our family live with the pieces, and I stopped getting up to fix them. When grief and betrayal collide, you must separate what you feel from what you can prove. Protect records, ask for professional help, and never sign a statement you know is incomplete just to keep the peace. Family loyalty should never require you to hide dangerous choices or carry consequences that belong to someone else. You can admit your own mistakes without accepting blame for another person's decisions. Real strength means setting boundaries, following facts, and refusing to sacrifice yourself to preserve a false image of family. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about courage, accountability, and rebuilding your life.